Hello everyone, Stepan here. This will be the first video on the Caro Kann, and I will make a series of videos, one for each variation, one for each individual variation in great detail. And in this first one, I will cover the basics of the opening principles, ideas for both sides, common traps, and I will give you the main line and the most common sideline variations for both sides. So this video should give you the idea of how the Caro Kann should be played with both colors. And once again, I will go into much more detail on each separate variation in a separate video for each one. The Caro Kann starts after the moves e4 for white. I went a bit too far here. So e4 and black replies with c6. This is now the Caro Kann, whatever happens afterwards. White, of course, has three moves from this position. By far the most common one is d4. I will cover the other two a bit later on. And first let me show you the main line of the Caro Kann, which is still the most commonly played variation. So in this position, black really only has one move in all variations. After d4, black responds with d5. And d5 is challenging the center, and that's the point of the c6 move. c6 was played to support the d5 push, to challenge the center afterwards and not immediately, such as in the e4, e5 classical openings, where after e4, black simply responds with e5. So black, instead of playing e5 or c5, which also challenges the d4 square, prepares to play d5 with the move c6. So this is fighting for the center one move later. And after d5, white has a couple of replies, and this is where the main line mostly branches out from the main line. And after d5, the most common reply is still knight to c3. This is the main theoretical variation. And from here on, black really has only one move once again. He has to capture on e4. So after d takes e4, white captures. Now black once again can branch out. I will cover those variations later. But the main move is bishop to f5, challenging the knight. The knight goes to g3, and after bishop to g6, saving the bishop. This is now the starting position of the main line of the Caro Kann. So from here on, the main idea for white is to exploit the positioning of the light-squared bishop on g6, which is slightly misplaced, and it has already wasted a couple of tempi. So white immediately strikes with h4 on the king side, and this move now threatens to trap the bishop with h5. So black will have to react. Black plays h6. h5 would be inferior because it would weaken too many squares and it would give a clear target to the knight and the queen, which are staring at h5. So h6 is making room for the bishop. After h6, white will continue with knight to f3, and after knight to d7 developing, h5, bishop will retreat to h7, and now from this position on, there are a few moves white could play, but still by far the most common move with over 20,000 games is bishop to d3. And this is now trying to trade the bishop, which moved several times, that being the black's light-squared bishop, for his light-squared bishop, which only moved once. So after this trade, for which black doesn't really have any alternative, bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, white is arguing that he has better development, more control in the center. But in exchange for that, black got white to weaken his king side, because the h4, h5 push, however attacking it might have been, it's weakening black's king side, and white can never really castle king side anymore. So from this position, black now has to develop, and the main idea is e6, opening up the dark squared bishop, bishop to f4, white is developing on the most common, most active diagonal, most active square for the bishop. And now this is one idea black has in the main line. He will force white to weaken himself some more on the queen side as well. So black develops with queen to a5 check. This is now forcing white to retreat the bishop to d2 or to play c3, and after the bishop retreats, now bishop to b4, challenging the bishop once again, and after white responds with c3, now weakening his king side as well, the bishop simply retreats, and black actually didn't waste the tempo because the bishop could have just developed from f8 to e7, but this way it provoked c3 as well. So after bishop to e7 and c4, now attacking the queen goes to c7, and you can see that black played only two moves. In fact, he didn't waste any tempi, but he provoked the moves c3, c4, and bishop back from f4 to d2. So this is a favorable position for black now, even though white still has a slight opening edge. But black has a perfectly playable position. From this position on, white will most commonly castle queenside. Castling kingside is too risky, and black will finish his development. Knight g to f6, white puts his king to safety with knight to b1, and black castles. And this is the starting position of the main line. I know I didn't go into too much detail. I just wanted to show you what the most commonly played moves are, and this is the position you will see in a lot of Caro Kann games. These are just the best moves from each side from move 2. So after e4, c6, this is the best both sides could play. So if you want to play the best moves engine-wise and best moves theoretically, this is the line you have to remember. And if you ask the engines, black stands slightly better in this position. It's minus 0.5, so black has half a point advantage, and practically speaking, that really isn't true, because engines don't like the fact that the h-pawn is overextended. The knight on g3 is pretty useless in this position. It will have to exchange itself, and that will activate the d7 knight after coming to f6. What the engines also like more about black's position is the king safety, because you can see that white will have to spend a couple of moves to start an attack, and black actually has a ready-made attack on the queen side already. So this is the starting position of the main line, and if you want to study it, I would advise you to look at least 10 or 20 games starting after bishop to f5, because from this position, the moves I just showed you were the main line, but there are other ideas you could go for. Of course, knight to g3 has to be played, bishop to g6 has to be played, but you don't have to start with h4 in this position. You can play knight to f3 from this move, you can play bishop to e3, you can play bishop to d3, challenging the light squared bishop immediately, and you don't have to weaken your king side, so that might even surprise your opponents. But the main line is h4, h6, making luft for the bishop, knight to f3, knight to d7. Developing the g knight to f6 would be a mistake from this position, because white could get a lot of activity with knight to e5 immediately. So knight to d7 is the most principled continuation for black, and after h5, retreating the bishop, white exchanges the bishop, and this is the main line. So this is what actually most strong players attempt to deviate from early on, because almost everybody knows the theory in this line. Okay, now let me go back to move 3. After knight to c3 and black taking on e4, and after white recaptures with the knight, bishop to f5 was the main move. However, black has two more options from this position, and two very good options, and arguably even better than bishop to f5, because they give black even more activity. The engines would disagree. The engines think that bishop to f5 is by far the best move, but two other variations are not playable but very good for black. The first one is the Karpov variation, named after Anatoly Karpov, of course, and that's knight to d7. And with knight to d7, black isn't challenging the e4 knight immediately, which is overextended, but he's preparing to support his other knight coming to f6 and to be able to recapture it with the d knight. And with that, he isn't making white push his h-pawn forward and challenge his light squared bishop, because the light squared bishop is still on c8. And now the most common continuation for white, and the best one, is knight to f3. Black, of course, continues with knight g to f6, and white is forced to recapture here with knight takes f6. And after knight takes f6, there are a few moves for white. If white doesn't take on f6, then black would take, and after let's say white defends it instead of taking with bishop to d3. After black takes on e4 and bishop takes, then knight d to f6 would be with tempo on the bishop, so black would be one tempo up. So the best move for white is to capture. And in the Karpov variation, after knight takes f6, you can see that development is equal now. Both sides have spent two moves and developed two pieces, one piece and one pawn each. The most active move for white in this position is bishop to c4. And bishop to c4 is staring at the f7 square and preparing to double attack it with the knight coming to either g5 or to e5. And white could even support that idea with queen to e2 later on. After bishop to c4, black still has to develop his light squared bishop before playing e6 and securing the f7 square by closing this diagonal. So black plays bishop to f5, opening up the bishop, and after white castles, f6. This is now the standard line in the Karpov variation. However, there are a few more moves that could occur from this position. If after knight to d7, black entering the Karpov variation, white plays knight to g5, and then he's immediately striking at f7, so black actually has to be a little careful, and the best move from this position is knight g to f6. This is the most commonly played line, and after bishop to d3, let's say, which is the most common move for black, e6, and white stands a bit better, but black has compensation because of white's loss of tempo. And challenging the knight, immediately chasing it away with h6 is okay, but it doesn't have to be played yet because white doesn't have that many threats. After knight to d7, another idea that that white could go for, which is very scary, which you have to remember, is queen to e2. And in this position, of course, white is threatening checkmate if you start to develop normally. Of course, if you play knight g to f6 from this position, then knight to d6 is checkmate, because the knight can't be taken and the king has no moves. So just remember that after queen to e2, you don't develop your g knight. You either play knight d to f6, to make sure you can capture the knight with the queen if it takes, or from this position you play e6 to make sure that the king has a square and the bishop can capture on d6. So this is the Caro variation, knight to d7, and I will make a separate video on it in which I will go into great detail about 20 moves in depth. Another line that black could go for after knight takes e4, which isn't bishop to f5, the most common line, or knight to d7, is knight to f6. And this is the second most popular continuation, and it branches out into two variations. One of them, of course, white has to capture now. That's the only move. Sorry for not mentioning that. He has to take, because once again, if he lets his knight to be challenged, it will just be with tempo. So knight takes f6, and now black has two options. One of them is to capture with the e pawn, one of them is to capture with the g pawn. E takes is the so-called Korchnoi variation, and it's a very drawing line, and it doesn't give black too much counterplay. The most common continuation would be black developing his bishops to d6 and to e6, white will castle, develop to d3, place the knight on f6 and castle kingside. So both sides will be equal in a slightly boring middle game, but any endgame is unfavorable for black because of the doubled pawns. And this now resembles the Berlin defense, or the exchange Royal Lopez, in which black doesn't really have a pawn majority on the king side. Another way to play this position after knight takes f6 is the so-called Bronstein-Larsen variation, with g takes f. And this variation gives black a lot more counterplay. It's supposed to be much worse. White is already positionally and strategically better, but black has a lot of initiative for the fact that he doubled his pawns and ruined his kingside structure. And the most common continuation is c3, bishop to f5, knight to f3, and so on and so on. Both sides develop, but you can see immediately that black has a lot of activity with his bishop pair. He will castle queenside, place the rook on g8, strike at the g file, so white can't really castle kingside, and the bishop is doing a lot of trouble on the queen side as well, so white will have a hard time castling and putting his king to safety, but in any endgame black will be slightly worse because he ruined his kingside pawn structure. So these are the moves after knight takes e4. Black could either go for bishop f5, the main line, knight to d7, the Caro variation, or knight to f6, which leads either to the Bronstein-Larsen variation or the Korchnoi variation. Now let me go back. In this position, after d5, white doesn't have to go for the main line with knight to c3. By far the most common variation today, which has even surpassed the main line, and it might be called the main line shortly, is the move e5. And this is the advanced variation of the Caro Kann. And this position gives white the biggest advantage if played properly. And he's counting on the fact that black lacks space in the center, and that white will extend his pawn structure further on, have a lot more space and a lot more piece activity. However, after black's most common move in this position, bishop to f5, black has a very improved French defense structure, and if you know the French defense, you know that the biggest problem is the bishop on c8. And in this position, after the bishop develops to f5, the bishop is already outside of the pawn chain, and after black plays e6, which is a very common idea in the advanced Caro Kann, black has an improved French defense. Now white can reply with two moves, basically. There are no more. The main move is knight to f3 in this position, and this is the so-called short variation. And this wasn't played that often until the 90s, until Nigel Short, the English grandmaster, employed it with great success in his own games. And Before this, white used to play a much more aggressive line. I will show you a bit later. From this position, black plays e6, closing down his pawn structure, and you can see that black has a lot of chances here because he has such a solid structure and it's extremely hard to penetrate. And black has a clear plan of pushing c5, getting his pawn break in, developing his knights to d7 and to e7, opening up the bishop, etc. So the most common continuation is bishop to e2, knight to d7, white castles, knight to e7, knight b to d2, and now c5 striking in the center. From here on, white could reply with either c4, he could take, he could play b6, he could play queen to e1 or rook to e1. There are a lot of lines for white, but this is just the let's say starting position of the short variation of the advanced Caro Kann. Another move after bishop to f5 for white would be knight to c3, and this is the old way for playing against the advanced variation, and this line offers white a lot of attacking chances, and black has to be extra careful. The continuation, which is played in 99% of the games starting from this position, is once again e6 for black. And now white pushes on the king side immediately with g4. The pawn is of course defended by the queen, it can't be taken, and now bishop to g6. Knight g to e2, preparing to play knight to f4, challenging the bishop on g6. c5 striking in the center, and black has to do this to seek counterplay immediately. If he doesn't, then he will be just smashed on the king side without any chances. h4. This is now threatening to trap the bishop, so black has to react. The best way to react is to play h5, sacrificing a pawn. h6 is too passive and it gives white a lot of play. So h5. Knight to f4, attacking the bishop, and giving up the bishop here and allowing knight takes g6 and playing f takes is just horrible and immediately losing, so black will retreat to h7 and give up the h5 pawn. And now after knight takes h5, black will play c takes d4, and after knight to b5, knight to c6, this is sort of the starting position of this line. And you can see that black has given up a pawn, but in any late middle game or end game, he will be much better because his central pawn structure is very dominant and it's controlling half the board, and white's king is very much unsafe as well. So if black manages to compensate for his lost pawn or regain his lost pawn, he will be better. However, this variation was replaced with the short variation starting with knight to f3, which is much simpler, much more passive for white, and it gives white, in fact, more chances than the other aggressive line. So this is the advanced variation of the Caro Kann, and what you have to know with black is that your main idea in this position is to play c5 and activate your pieces. You have to, of course, do that. If white at any point threatens to take your knight, you don't have to take your bishop, I'm sorry. You can either go for a plan of h7, h6, bishop h7, retreating, or you can simply recapture with your knight, place it on f5, and it will be very active. And in some positions, after the knight is on f5, white will play g4, and you can play knight to h4, challenging the f3 knight. So these are just some ideas. The other thing you could do is, after playing c5, transfer the bishop to h7 by playing h6, and then place the knight on c6 to attack e5. And this is one of the most aggressive ways for black to play. And once you've played c5, you can sacrifice the pawn. You don't have to have the knight on d7 in order to recapture it. You can gain it back later. After c5, knight to c6, rook to c8, activating on the long file, black has a lot of activity. So the advanced variation is one of the most interesting ways for white to fight against the Caro Kann, but it's also one of the most aggressive ways for black to play the Caro Kann, and it gives both sides great chances. Once again, I will go into a lot of detail in a separate video. This is just the basic ideas. Okay, after d5 by black, knight to c3, as we said, is the main line. e5 is the advanced variation. There are a few more lines that white could play. The third most popular line is after d5 for white to play f3. This is the so-called fantasy variation of the Caro Kann. It's also known as the Tartakower variation, but fantasy is its main name, I think. And with this move, white is simply reinforcing the e4 pawn and asking black to take it. And if black captures with d takes c, white will simply recapture with f takes. So this is supporting the center, not using the pieces to support the center, but the pawns. The most common way for black to play is to take the pawn, so d takes e4, f takes e4, and the only active move black has here is e5, striking in the center, disrupting white's idea immediately, and white will continue with knight to f3, bishop to g4, pinning the knight, bishop to c4, knight to d7, c3, and this is the starting position of the fantasy variation, mainline fantasy variation. And the engines think white is slightly better, but I like the position for black because I think white's pawns are overextended. This diagonal is very weak towards white king, and if he doesn't castle soon, he could get in a lot of trouble. And the center is actually very weak. Despite having two central pawns, it's easy for black to disrupt that and to capture one of these and to weaken the center and to actually get hanging pawns for white in the center, which will easily be attacked or stopped. Another way for black to play, but a more passive way, is to react to f3 with d6, just solidifying his structure. However, one major downside of this position is that white is never going to take ed, which means that you have a French defense bishop stuck on c8, and this bishop is now very hard to develop, and you will have to play b6 and bishop to a6 to develop it, which is weakening, because if white strikes with c4, then your queen side is already weakened. But I will go into much more detail in a separate video about the fantasy. Let's go back to the main position. After d5, so knight to c3, e5 or f3 are the main moves. Another idea that white has, instead of entering the main lines or the advanced variation or the fantasy variation, the third most popular continuation is to exchange the central pawns, and that's the so-called exchange variation of the Caro Kann. And with this move, e takes d, white is simplifying the position and just saying that he has an opening advantage with the tempo up and that he will have a favorable position. So from this position on, white has a few ideas. Fischer used to employ one opening idea from this position, which was slightly passive, but it gives white a lot of chances. And that's playing bishop to d3, simply developing his pieces, castling kingside, placing the knight on f3, placing the knight on d2 and playing c3, solidifying. So this is one way to play, but it doesn't give white that much counterplay. And in most exchange Caro Kann positions, black will usually fianchetto his dark squared bishop, place the knight on f6, and develop that way. And black will have a problem with this diagonal, with the checks from the b5 square on the king, and in some positions that could be really scary. But I'm just going to show you one most common variation for white to play against the Caro Kann with the exchange, and the most active way. And this position, which I'm about to show you, has become the one of the most aggressive ways for white to fight the Caro Kann, and it's become one of the favored variations by strong players. And that's the Panov attack, or the Panov-Botvinnik attack, and it starts with c4. And with the move c4, white is accepting an isolated queen's pawn, but in exchange for that, he is disrupting black's entire idea of challenging the center, and black has nothing in the center anymore, and white is getting a lot of piece activity for that. So from this position on, black could of course play a couple of moves. The most common one is to develop the knight to f6, supporting d5. Black could also immediately take the pawn, but that's not as good. And there are a lot of variations to cover in the Panov, and once again a separate video will be made going into a lot of detail. So yeah, that's the exchange Caro Kann. And there are a few other variations apart from the Panov, but you will see the Panov in 90% of your games. One more thing I would like to show you is this move. After d5 and white playing knight to c3, the only alternative to taking the pawn for black is to play g6, and this move is supposed to be much better for white, but black actually has some chances, and this might be a great surprise weapon for black, because I'm sure that most white players aren't used to seeing this in the Caro Kann. And g6 is a great surprise weapon, which could lead to interesting positions, but you have to know what to do after white pushes with e5. So it could be problematic, and you could have a lot less space than white does. This is the so-called Gurgenidze variation, named after a Georgian chess master. So yeah, okay, these are the most common lines. I wouldn't want to go into too much detail from here on. These were the most common variations. I will cover each one in a separate video. Just try to, if you want to play the Caro Kann, use these basics to decide on a variation which you like. And it's important to study each one in great detail, and the main line might be a good starting point just to get an idea of how the Caro Kann is played. And you will notice in most lines that white has more space, which black is conceding at the start of the game, and white has more piece activity. But if black manages to survive the first 10 or 15 moves without getting into trouble and without being too passive, then black has a lot of fighting chances, and in most Caro Kann variations, black actually has an edge engine-wise as well, if he manages to survive the first 10 or 15 moves. Yeah, once again, this is the main line, so try to study each variation, at least the basics of it, and stay tuned for videos on each separate one in detail. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope you got to learn something about the Caro Kann if you play it, and especially if you've never played it, and I hope you got an idea for an opening you could have as an alternative to e4 if you are playing e5 or the Sicilian or something else so far. Thanks very much. Bye.